move on to the decontamination portion of the training. So I'm going to go through several slides just going through what to look for when decontaminating a boat, where we're focusing on our decontaminations, and do's and don'ts of using the decontamination unit. Once again, here's our coding for all AIS work with decontaminations. This would be all under AIS 5. Alright, so the WIT process overall. Our risk assessment should only take 1 to 2 minutes. This is involving talking with the boater, asking where they've been, getting their registration and their license number, and then looking over the boat. So a fairly quick, efficient process that we go through. If it is deemed a high-risk inspection, which I will go over later on how that is deemed a high-risk or low-risk situation, that can take up to 5 minutes. There's more questions that need to be asked, and you have to spend a little bit more time inspecting the boat. And then the decontaminations overall, the time spent on a decontamination can be very variable. If you have a watercraft completely inundated with zebra mussels, this could be an entire day adventure. Or, as mentioned before, if we're just flushing the lower unit of a motor, that's just a couple minutes and they're on their way. Alright, a few things to look for in your risk assessment. Where are they from? Are they out of state? Or if their boat has been on an infested water body in the last 30 days. Just looking over the boat, you should be able to tell fairly quickly if this boat has been moored in a water body for a long period of time and there's algae or slime just caked onto the boat. This is going to raise the risk level, because with a watercraft being in a water body for an extended period of time, the risk goes up significantly with zebra mussels being able to attach to that watercraft. If there's any standing water, or if there's any water in the ballast tanks, so making sure that all the plugs are pulled, there's no water in the live well, and looking at the bilge and the ballast tanks, make sure that water is not present. And then if the watercraft is complex or not. So when I say complex, you're looking to see if it has multiple motors, if it's a kicker motor, trolling motor, and then whether or not it has interior compartments. So most of your boats that you're going to be looking at are most likely going to be a complex boat. Your fishing boats are all going to have at least interior compartments, and most of them are going to have multiple motors. If there are 2 or more of these are present, you are now in a situation of a high-risk assessment, and that will take up to 5 minutes, but shouldn't take longer than that unless you find attached zebra mussels. In order to do a standing water decon, this is a situation where we can't get rid of all of the water. So with our ballast tanks, they actually have a very poor design, and we're trying to work with that with our watercraft developers. Their port where they release the water on a ballast tank is not on the bottom of that bag inside of the ballast tank, it's on the side. So inevitably they have 1 inch to 2 inches of water in the bottom of their ballast tank, which makes it very hard to get rid of all of the water. So if this boat has been on an infested water body and there is still water in that ballast tank, we're going to want to fill those ballast tanks up with hot water and then hit the ballast tank bilge and remove all of that water. And that should kill all risk associated with the ballast tanks. And then if there's standing water in the watercraft, we're going to be using low pressure and filling up the live well or the motor well with 120 degree water to kill any possible AIS present or any veligers present in that area of the boat. Or obviously if there's any AIS on board, that will also require decontamination. So there's a few different types of decontaminations. First one being a plant decontamination. These are very simple overall, especially if you can remove them by hand, and that's what we hope for when seeing plants present on a watercraft or a trailer. If you can simply remove those by hand, the risk is now gone. You removed any risk associated with that watercraft. But let's say, for example, you trailered your boat and you have vegetation stuck between your watercraft and your trailer and you cannot remove that vegetation. This is going to require a planned decontamination. Next, it's going to be a standing water decontamination. As mentioned before, if you can't get rid of all the water present in a watercraft, this is going to signal a standing water decontamination. This is a situation where you have an excessive amount of water that cannot be just soaked up with a sponge or a towel. If you can soak it up with a sponge or a towel, then we're good to go. They can be on their way. And that's why we have sponges present at our inspection stations. If you can't, you're going to hit it with low pressure at 120 degrees for 2 minutes. It's going to be 3 different time frames that we're looking at. Any low pressure situation with 120 degrees is 2 minutes. The other way I help people remember this, how many seconds are in 2 minutes?
120.
120. So the math adds up. If you're looking at a ballast tank, with the amount of water that can be held in a ballast tank, we want to get that water soaking for 5 minutes if you're looking at a ballast tank. But for all other standing water decons in the boat, it's 120 seconds. Now, if you are having to do a full decontamination, this is going to be a situation where you have viable mussels attached to the watercraft. Or if you even have dead mussels on the watercraft, this will usually signify a full decontamination. And this will be 140 degrees for 10 seconds on the exterior surfaces of the boat or when doing a motor flush on the motor. 10 seconds are quick and easy, but we want to make sure that we're having constant pressure and constant contact for that 10-second time frame. For the 120 degree water temperature, that's 2+ minutes on interior compartments. When they say 2 minutes plus, we say this because when you're using our decontamination units, you will have a temperature dial that you can dial in that heater to get your water to a certain temperature. Once that water hits that certain temperature, it will kill the heating element, and so the water temperature can fluctuate coming out of the decon unit by 10 to 20 degrees. So when in doubt, always just extend that period of time that you're decontaminating slightly. Each one of our toolkits will have a temperature gun in there, so you'll be able to tell how hot that water is coming out of the decontamination unit. What's the message? Clean, drain, dry every time. That means no water, no plants, and no mud present on your watercraft or your trailer. For anyone not familiar with watercraft, here is a diagram with our different attachments or different components of your trailer and watercraft. So moving from the front of the boat to the back of the boat, up front, a compartment that you might not think of checking would be your dock line compartment or where you put your anchor. But your anchor, a lot of times, if people don't take care of their stuff, they might not get rid of that mud when they pull their anchor up, and you could have mud on your anchor or standing water from your docking lines releasing into that front compartment. Other storage compartments that might get saturated with water would be where you store your life jackets. People get done wakeboarding or tubing and they throw their life jacket off right into the compartment. That water can drain into there and you could have some risk associated with those compartments. Your live well moving towards the back of the boat. Obviously this is an area of risk where you have water supposed to be in that compartment. So we want to make sure every time that we're checking a boat, if it has live wells, we want to make sure we're opening up that compartment and making sure that the plug is pulled and there's no water present. And then your bilge. In the back of the boat, you want to open that compartment up and make sure there's no standing water in there. And if there is, you will want to ask the watercraft owner whether or not they would like to remove that water and use their bilge pump, or if they're comfortable with you running their bilge pump for them. In most situations, they'll want to do this, but you always want to ask because we need to get that water removed, and the only way we're going to be able to do that is with the bilge pump. Moving to the back of the boat, this is probably the highest risk area with all of the nooks and crannies and dark spaces that are present on the back of your boat, and we're constantly moving water through that motor. So you want to look at that, the motor's intake on the bottom of the lower unit, look inside the prop, and then look at the gimbal area, which is the area where the motor attaches to the watercraft hull. This is an area of the boat that I will want all inspectors to be using a flashlight looking into these areas. These are very dark areas, and a lot of times you're not going to be able to see all the way inside of your prop, or even in your gimbal area, see effectively enough to have 100% certainty that there's not any zebra mussels present. Moving forward on the trailer, you have your roller bunks. We normally have two different types of bunks. You have your roller bunks, or you have carpeted bunks. Carpeted bunks are going to have more capabilities of housing a moist environment to leave mussels or veligers viable for a longer period of time than your roller bunks. But your roller bunks are going to cause more issues with having vegetation present, because there's a lot more surface area to grab vegetation that's nearby that could have higher risk associated. So a couple things to think about when you're looking over the two different types of trailers. And then your overall hull. So when you're looking at a watercraft, there's no point in looking at any part of the watercraft that's above the waterline, because how would they be able to attach? They need water to survive. So you want to feel below the waterline, and as mentioned before, those settlers that can attach or live mussels that can attach will be below that waterline and usually associated with dark areas or rough areas. So weld seams, dark areas inside the prop or your intake ports, or on your trailer. You know, some people, you never know how people are storing their units, so you want to make sure you're checking everything. And then your through-hull fittings. That is labeled up in the front, but there's a lot of times there's multiple through-hull fittings on a boat, and that's going to be about a quarter-size hole in the size of the hull or in the bottom side of the hull that you will definitely need a flashlight for to look inside, because it's going to be deeper than your finger is long. So it's a very long, dark channel that we need to be checking to make sure that there's not any zebra mussels present. A good giveaway here, if there is some issues with zebra mussels, is that let's say the watercraft looks dry overall, but there's a wet spot near one of your motor intake or your through-hull fitting. It's probably because something's clogging that up and the water is only seeping out and wasn't able to just free flow out of that system and then dry up. That's a dead giveaway that you probably have zebra mussels present on a watercraft. Here's just a few of our terminology, our boat terminology that we use for our boats. I went over several of these, but as we move forward through a few slides, I will point these out specifically. On this slide, we have transducer. We have the transducer, speed wheel, and Pitot tubes highlighted. These are going to be the back end of your watercraft, and the reason why we're looking at these is just, as you can see, they're right angles. There's a lot of surface variation here where they can attach onto, and it's an area of the boat that probably gets overlooked. One of the main things that we want to make sure that we're doing is getting down and looking on the underside of these things, which will require you to get on your hands and knees, but just a necessary evil that we need to be doing to make sure that we are making sure there's no risk associated with these boats that we're looking at. A couple different types of motors that you'll look at besides your main your motor on your boat would be your trolling motors. These could be on the front end of the boat or the back end of your boat, and these can either be electric or gasoline. And then looking at your main motor for your boat, there's 4 different types of motors that you could be looking at. An inboard outboard engine, or just an outboard motor, which is your stereotypical motor that you'd see on anything from a simple boat like a John boat all the way up to your top-of-line Lund or Ranger boats. Inboard motors or engines, these are going to be seen primarily on recreational boats for skiing or wakeboarding. And then your jet engines. This is going to be your jet skis or your fun recreated jet engine boats that you might see on some of your larger water bodies. The one thing to note about jet engines versus your other motors is that jet engines need to be started before any water is ran through the motor. In every other setting, you want to make sure that water is running through your intake ports before you start up the engine, otherwise you could ball game it. But we can go over that more out in the field. So I mentioned this before, there can be multiple through hull fittings. In this situation, you see the through hull fitting here towards the back end of the boat. This is a boat that I was talking about before that is very stereotypical of a high-risk situation. You can see how much dirt and grime is on that boat, and it's very evident that this boat has been sitting in the water for a long period of time. Other thing to look at is your intake ports. See how it's just wet and saturated down there? This boat is completely inundated with zebra mussels, but those wet areas near those intake ports or near your plugs is just a dead giveaway that there's probably some issues with drainage. But looking at that lower unit as a whole, a few of the different terminology that you might hear me talk about is your prop or your anti-cavitational plates. And on those anti-cavitational plates, it's just a right angle, and there's usually a weld seam on the bottom of it. So you have a rough surface and you have a 90-degree angle, and most of our motors are black, so it's a dark area, it's rough, and it's a hard surface. So all the characteristics of what a zebra mussel needs to attach to. And then that gimbal area, there's a lot of bolts and screws and hose that are running from your motor to your watercraft. These are all areas where zebra mussels can nestle themselves into and be unseen to the naked eye. So you want to make sure you're spending a decent amount of time looking at that gimbal area and making sure that there is no zebra mussels present. One thing I want everyone documenting when going through every inspection is whether or not the drain plug is pulled. At the end of the year, we try to look at our boating statistics and see what type of compliance that we have with our watercraft users and see if our efforts are increasing our compliance with pulling our plugs. So if those plugs are not pulled, we want to make sure we document that in our comment section on our watercraft inspection app. Moving over to the left, you see that trim tab. Once again, a 90-degree angle, an area that most people aren't going to get down and look at when pulling out of a water body. So this is a high-risk area that we want to make sure that there's nothing attached to that. Here's another type of watercraft. This is an inboard outboard motor. As you can see, the head of that motor is not exposed. You're going to treat this motor as the same as an outboard motor when running it. You want to make sure there's water running through that intake port before we're starting that engine, but you're looking for a lot of the same things in regards to that motor, except that the head of the motor is not going to be present. This would be a carpeted bunk. These larger boats are probably going to have carpeted bunks versus rollers. And then now I will go over all of our types of watercrafts as a whole, anything from simple to very complex. Our hand launch boats, self-explanatory. These are boats that we are launching into water bodies by hand. This would be your paddle boards, your kayaks, inner tubes with no motor associated with the watercraft. Some people may not think that these watercrafts need to stop at inspection stations, but they do. Anything that essentially can float in the water needs to stop at our inspection stations. Moving over to our simple boat, that's going to be your John boat. Maybe one of the first boats you might have purchased, or just a small boat that you might use on a smaller water body just to get out offshore. But this is going to have no interior compartments and usually one motor attached to it on the back. And then the most prevalent boats that you'll be looking at is your complex boats. multiple motors, interior compartments, and these also need to be inspected. And then hopefully you don't have to deal with any of these, but moving over to very complex boats, these are going to be your cabin cruisers, your cargo hauling ships or boats, or ballast tank boats that have anywhere from 1 to up to 7 ballast tanks associated with that watercraft. I would say over 90% of your boats you're going to be looking at are going to be in that complex boat category, and most of them are going to be angling boats. Here's a list of a few of our hand-launched boats that you might see. The most common would be your kayaks or canoes, but you also might see a raft or a windsurfer out on some of our river systems, or paddle boards, sailboard, float tube, or inner tube. So there's no trailer, there's no compartments associated with these, no engine. These are typically going to be clean, drain, and dry already, just because there's not really any areas for water to accumulate. But we want to make sure that this hasn't been sitting in the water for a long period of time where it allowed for zero mussels to attach to them. So that's why we make sure that they're still coming through our inspection station. And also you want to make sure that there's not any vegetation on there or any mud. You know, people pull up their kayaks sometime on the river and they don't clean them off when they're done. So there could be some mud or some water associated with those. Here's a picture of one of those John boats I was describing before. You just have a couple of rows of seating, but there's actually no compartments associated with it. So the two main things you're looking at for here is the plug is pulled. There's no water in the lower unit of the motor, so you want to lower that lower unit, make sure there's no water coming out of it. And then you're inspecting the hull of the boat and making sure that there's nothing rough on the exterior portion of the boat that would signify settlers on the boat or any mussels. And making sure there's no vegetation on the prop of the motor or on the watercraft or trailer. Alright, with our complex boats, these are going to be closed hull boats or have potentially multiple interior compartments and multiple motors. Here you can see this is a wreck motor, but I would say 90% of the boats you're going to look at are going to be angling boats. But here's an inboard outboard motor. The biggest thing we want to do and do every single time is lower that lower unit. You can house over a gallon of water in those lower units at times. So this also helps the boaters remember to do this on their own. This is an overlooked thing that most watercraft users aren't doing, is once they're leaving a water body, just lowering that lower unit really quick, releasing that water. It should only take 30 seconds to a minute, and then you can raise it back up. But we want to make sure that we're getting as much water out as possible. This is a fun little slide. You should never see a boat of this caliber in South Dakota, but you have pretty much every different type of boat possible here. You have a simple boat with just an outboard motor and some bench seats. You have a complex boat there on the bottom right, and then you have a very complex boat approaching the photo, and then you have a large cargo ship that's the size of a football field here, and that would take probably a week, if not more, to decontaminate. But luckily we live in South Dakota and out on the Great Lakes or along the coast where we shouldn't have to deal with those. All right, here's just a breakdown of where these reside for risk levels. So all of those hand-launched boats don't have motors or interior compartments. Those are going to be very low biological risk for AIS to be present. But as you have more complexity with your watercraft, it becomes more of a risk associated with that. So as we move up from simple boat up to complex and very complex, that risk level increases. All right, I've talked about this a little bit so far, but we want to make sure that we know where to look for on this boat, and we have some acronyms to help us remember how to go about our inspection to make it as efficient as possible and as thorough as possible. So when we are inspecting our boat, we want to use our heads. That stands for H, your hull and trailer and the exterior portion of your boat. You then want to move to the engine or the motor and the transom area. Once you're done with that, this should be the entirety of the exterior of the boat, and now you're going to move your way into the boat. And A will stand for your anchor rope, and your equipment. So pretty much looking at all of those interior compartments other than your stereotypical live well or underneath the back end of your boat where your bilge is at. And then D, drain interior compartments. This is where you're going to want to make sure all plugs associated with that watercraft are pulled and no water is able to be retained in any of those compartments. So the hull. Here's a few different photos of inspecting the hull, but as you can see, this is going to require you to get on your hands and knees and make sure that we're looking all the way underneath the watercraft and making sure there's no vegetation attached between the trailer and the watercraft, and that we're looking at all those rough areas and those nooks and crannies and making sure there's no muscles attached to here either. You want to feel the side of the hull and just do one quick sweep around all the watercraft, 360. This should only take you 15 seconds. Just quickly rub your hand across the side and make sure there's no rough surfaces. And then when you're looking at the underside of the watercraft, you want to look for high-risk indicators like that dirt and grime. That would signify them being in a water body for a long period of time, and then you're going to want to make sure that you're looking very closely to see if there's any muscles attached. Here's an inboard motor, and you can see the prop is inside this cavity on the watercraft. Another reason why we need to have a flashlight on board, because this can be very dark depending on what time this watercraft is coming through the inspection station, and you want to make sure that you're looking at over that very closely to make sure there's no muscles attached inside of that inboard motor prop. Through hull fittings. This top left photo, you can see a zebra mussel attached to that intake port, or into that through hull fitting. Dirty, grimy. It's a dead giveaway that you should be looking a lot more closely to that. The bottom left photo, you can see that those zebra mussels have completely clogged that intake port, and a lot of times this can be an issue with burning up motors for your bilge pump or for your motor overall, because they can clog lines completely and not allow water to be flowing through and keeping your motor cool. But all those little holes that you see there for the through-hull fitting, these are all areas where we need to make sure that we're using our flashlight to make sure that we can say with 100% certainty that there's nothing inside of those. Here's your roller trailer. As you can see, a lot of surfaces that can grab a hold of weeds and pull them and uproot them out of a lake system. One thing we want to be careful for when we're decontaminating one of these is that we're staying away from the wiring on our trailer or our boats. We can damage that wiring if we're hitting those connections right behind the lights. So you want to make sure that you're staying away from those. And then with the carpeted bunks, the thing to note there is that we're not hitting high pressure on that carpeted area. We don't know how brittle or how old those trailers are, and we are liable for any damages during our decontamination. So we want to make sure that we're going about everything correctly with the right amount of pressure and temperature. As mentioned before, you can see that moisture around that intake port. Dead giveaway that something's clogging it up, and we want to investigate further. There's hundreds of mussels that are completely clogging this up, and I would be very surprised if this motor is even functional. Here's a closer look at that gimbal area. This is an infested watercraft. As you can see, there's mussels all over that gimbal area. But it just goes to show you how many nooks and crannies that you're looking at. Even these recessed areas where you might have bolts or screws at, that is enough area for them to take hold, and some of those are recessed and you might not see them in there, so you want to make sure you're taking a flashlight to all of those recessed areas where you might have bolts associated with the motor or the gimbal area. The bottom left, that's the anti-cavitational plates, completely inundated with zebra mussels. As I said, these are great areas where zebra mussels love to attach, and we want to make sure that we're paying close attention and looking over these thoroughly when we're inspecting our watercraft. Here's a photo of that recessed area around a bolt on the back end of a motor. Several muscles up here on the far right photo. All of these are completely inundated, and this is a situation that you would not be able to decontaminate this at a roving wood station, and we would have to bring this back to the shop and decontaminate, and this could be up to an entire day to decontaminate a boat that's this infested. All right, this would be more indicative of like a sailboat. Looking at the prop shaft, another area where you need a flashlight for if you have to deal with a sailboat. Let's say you're down south and you're dealing with people on the river, or if you're at the Mitchell station and someone's going out to Chamberlain, you want to make sure you're getting a flashlight up where that prop shaft is meeting the hull of the boat and making sure that there's no zebra mussels up in that dark recessed area associated with the prop shaft. And that prop shaft support, there's going to be a lot of weld lines on that area. That's going to make that area really rough and more conducive for a zebra mussel to attach to. So you want to make sure that you're looking over that very well as well. Trim tabs are to help balance the boat during wavy situations. You want to make sure that we're looking all over those trim tabs on the bottom side and on those 90-degree angles. These are all areas where they like to attach. As you can see in the photo, on all those right angles, there's zebra mussels attached to it. And here's what a transducer and a Pitot tube looks like. All inundated with zebra mussels, just making sure that we're looking over the entirety of these when inspecting a boat, especially if they've been on an infested water body. So that center photo is going to be a lot more conducive for ripping up vegetation, but all of these, if you've spent any time on the water, most situations than not, you're going to be pulling up some sort of mud or vegetation with an anchor. So we want to make sure that we are identifying what compartment is the anchor compartment, and if you feel comfortable enough, I would encourage you to